couple of people to talk about what happened in Kenya. This is still an evolving story, and it shows that the danger exists in so many parts of the world. We have John Temin. He's director of the Horn of Africa programs at the Centers of Innovation at the United States Institute of Peace. You can find them at USIP. We also have David Shin. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, and you can find him at AmbShin on both of them on Twitter. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
John, I'm going to start with you. I guess my first question is, do you think the U.S. has handled this situation? I mean, right now we have troops in more countries in Africa than we've ever had. Americans may not realize that. And there's a lot of issues going on, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but also, of course, North Africa, which maybe Americans are more familiar with. When this happened in Kenya with Somalia next door, I mean, Kenya used to be a country that people could kind of focus on in Africa as being one of the more stable. You could go there for for vacations and that kind of thing. But it seems like with this attack, it shows that the danger exists, and a lot of these problems are spreading now throughout sub-Saharan Africa.
That's correct. That Kenya has often been seen as a regional hub and a relative bastion of stability in East Africa compared to some of its neighbors, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia. That said, I don't think this attack is too surprising, unfortunately, tragic as it is. There have been a lot of concerns about activity like this ever since Kenya sent troops into Somalia to try to help stabilize the situation in Somalia. Kenya sent in troops as part of an African Union peacekeeping mission there. Ever since, the Shabaab has been threatening attacks on Kenyan soil, and there have been some smaller ones before this massive one. Shabaab has also proven an ability to attack elsewhere. They had a large attack in Uganda a couple years ago. But this is clearly their biggest activity so far outside of Somalia.
David, Shabaab obviously making quite a statement in Kenya. A lot of Westerners, Americans were targeted. There's some reports that it's still ongoing, although the Kenyans say they have it under control. This is a very serious situation that Americans should be very clearly concerned about.
Well, it is serious, and the mall that was selected for this attack was probably done so for several reasons. One, it's an upscale Kenyan mall with a lot of fairly wealthy Kenyans, but it also has an international clientele to it. It also has some Israeli links, although surprisingly they seem not to have been singled out by the Al-Shabaab. And I assume they must have known about the Israeli investment in the mall, but very little has been said about that by Al-Shabaab. But it was an effort to gain attention, and attention they got in spades. This is by far the biggest event that Al-Shabaab has done since the bombing in Kampala, Uganda in July of 2010.
John, again, Americans may not realize to the extent that the United States is involved in Africa. I mean, we have, again, troops in, it depends on the day, but I believe it's something like 34 African countries now. We have a significant presence in Mali, of course, Djibouti, we've always had a presence in. Libya, we're very few now in Libya, most have been pulled. But really across the region, we spend a lot of money. There's a lot of lives out there. We have Americans, of course, volunteering across Africa. What does this do for U.S. involvement in Africa? We're more involved now than ever before, and Shabaab pulls an attack off like this in a country, again, that's considered to be one of the more stable on the continent.
I think it will lead to a lot of security conversations and a lot of discussions about how secure Americans and all foreigners are going to be in a place like Kenya that was, until recently at least, considered to be quite secure. My hope, though, is that the pendulum does not swing too far in the other direction, because more engagement in Africa is generally a good thing. Africa has some of the fastest growing economies anywhere in the world. And so I think U.S. businesses and American interests do have a lot to do in Africa, and that helps a lot in terms of African development and countering some of the poverty that is still very persistent on the continent. But a lot of organizations and a lot of businesses and individuals are going to be asking themselves some new questions, I think, after this.
Ambassador, there have been a number of nations that have made some significant strides in recent years in Africa. What should the U.S. do in response to the attack? Is there anything we can change? Should we beef up our security situation across the continent? I mean, again, we have troops in a lot of locations in Africa right now.
Well, you're correct that there are troops in a lot of locations, but in most cases those numbers in these different locations are quite small. The exception would be Djibouti, where you have a large presence. In Niger, where you have the most recent drone operation set up, the last figure I heard was about 100, maybe somewhat over 100 at the moment. In most other locations, it's pretty modest numbers, so it's not as though American troops are flooding the continent by any means. In terms of steps that the U.S. might take, clearly there's got to be a stepped-up effort on the intelligence side, which is the first line of defense for this sort of thing. And obviously, in this case, neither Kenyan intelligence nor anyone else's intelligence caught it in advance. So to that extent, it was a real gap in the effort. Who knows how many efforts have been stopped as a result of good intelligence? We don't hear about those. But this one was a problem. And you're probably going to see somewhat of a step up in security, but the efforts to step up security at American installations in Africa is very high already. There's not a great deal more you can do other than pulling out, and I don't think we're prepared to do that.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Former U.S. Ambassador David Shin former U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia, David Shin, thank you for joining us from D.C. Also, along with him, John Temin, Director of the Horn of Africa Programs, Center of Innovation, United States Institute of Peace. You can find them both on Twitter at USIP and at AMB Shin with 2 N's. Thanks for joining us. And again, as you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of stories coming out of Africa in the months and for years to come, for that matter, as we are continue to stay involved and these countries continue to evolve. Thanks again for joining us from D.C.
Thank you.
Thank you.